Okay, welcome to High Pitch Conversations in a New Key. Today we were thinking of talking about ambition. On the one hand, that's a placeholder for a certain type of way of being, and drive and as another placeholder. And this conversation emerged from an experience people had of watching, let's say, their parents have successful careers, and on the one hand, really admiring what they achieved. When they, on the other hand, noticing that something of their life or their potential that wasn't part of their career maybe had been robbed from them or was missing. And then we all reflected on that kind of tension in our own lives at certain stages in our life, maybe at choice points where we'd have a drive to pursue something, and wondering if we were ambitious or just kind of getting the felt sense of that distinction we were trying to make. And Ria formulated the question, the seed question today as, what are the rewards to create parallel spaces where there is intention, exploration, and creativity instead of ambition, planning, and success? So that's a really good seed question. And yeah, we'll just take it from there.
Well, something is coming up for me because I watched an unusual movie for me this weekend. It's called The Family Man with Nicolas Cage. And the movie is from 2000. And I watched it because one of my clients, he's a male CEO and has a toddler at home. And a lot of our sessions recently have been about him kind of coming to terms with what becoming a parent is changing in him and his ambition. And he's also in the middle of a job search. So this movie was coming up for him a lot, and he loves this movie. And so I went and watched it as my homework. And in the movie, Nicolas Cage is like this high flying Wall Street banker, he starts, he's got a Ferrari, he's got the closet full of bespoke suits and the big watch. And he's living in the penthouse and he has a beautiful woman he barely knows the next morning. It's like this idealized kind of epic, ambitious life. He's on top of the world. And then he runs into a kind of a guardian angel figure, kind of like what's the Jimmy Stewart? It's a Wonderful Life. And he wakes up one morning in bed in New Jersey with 2 kids and a wife, his high school sweetheart. And so it's like that road less traveled. And the movie is very funny and very sweet as he starts to as this Wall Street bachelor settles into his New Jersey existence. And it's very nuanced. I mean, it's very obvious in some ways, but it's like from the clothes that he's wearing, he's a tire salesman, all the broken dreams, and he keeps looking at her and she's so happy in their life. And he can't understand how she can stand it until he starts to settle into the new rhythm and falls in love with the kids. And so I think there's something in that framing. And Bonnie, as you were speaking, I was just noticing that the movie leaves us at the end, and I don't want to spoil it for anyone who's interested, but it never really completes the picture. It literally leaves us wondering what happens when you let go of that first type of ambition. And then you come around to this, deeper experience of life, or this acceptance, or this, I don't even know what you would call it. And then he kind of tries to reconcile the two at the end. And I think that's what the movie wanted us to think, was that you could kind of have it all, but then we were left, and so I'm just kind of sitting there in that space, what is that ideal? space beyond the end of the movie. It was a fun movie.
Where my reflections have taken me, and then interestingly enough, it also came up in my work with clients just this past week, was how we'll often have that question, exactly how it was framed at the end of the movie. Can we patch it all together? How much can we fit in? I once wrote a piece that was titled "You Can't Have It All, and That's Actually Okay." Because I do think we just try and squish more and more in to feel like we've somehow accomplished success. So the piece that was lingering for me and that then became stronger was that rather than looking at the question from the shape or form a life takes, like whether one ends up having a career or living in a city or in the countryside or becoming a parent, like rather than looking at the exterior shape that a life takes, I got much more curious about where, from which self is the life expression coming from, and that then could lead to all kinds of forms and shapes and versions of life. And it's much more it's almost like a tone or a quality, a groundedness versus a buzziness. Like it felt like those things were distinct when I was considering different lives I was aware of. And then I was paying attention to myself too, and noticing that this whole contemplation of, is my drive coming more from what I call my outside self, my constructed self, my ego self? Is it coming from that? Or is it coming from this, in a way, what feels like a lot deeper, truer self? That question that's been really alive for me, I'd say, since my early 20s. It's not like it's answered and then I'm done. It's more that question and that inner discernment and distinction is ongoing. Like, which self am I rising out of into life, into the day, into doing the dishes, into my work, into my creativity, can switch at a moment's notice. So it's much more an ongoing awareness, paying attention, and then making a choice as I become more aware. And in this conversation with a client just yesterday, we were contemplating this because she was incredibly exhausted. And I see this a lot with people who've done sort of the first version of the movie, which is really being very driven by an exterior sense of what success looks like, which is probably connected with something that is truly interior, that is very authentic to the person, but then it gets wrapped up in society's version of what success looks like. And I find a lot of my clients just so exhausted, like bone tired from doing that. And so we were exploring, rather than how to kind of symptom patch up that life and try and fix it, we just went into a really beautiful contemplation together of having her take that seat in herself that is just her true self, and sitting there for a while with her, and then contemplating what would life, what would expression, what would language look like from there. It was just so beautiful to be present with her in that exploration. And it felt like, so the image, this is my long way of getting to the image I wanted to share, but it felt like that our behavior is kind of like the vegetation, the plants and the trees above the ground. Like that's our expression that people can see and interact with. But then there's these roots that go down, and the roots can be nourished and derive energy from our constructed self, from the person that we think we are a lot of the time. Or we can actually shift the roots over. So it's much more radical, which I think is so sweet, like radical as in actually at the root, right? The radix. We can shift at the root level to deriving from our true self. And then we don't need to fuss and worry too much about what's up there. It's just that the nourishment will come from a different place, state, self within ourselves. And then it's to be discovered. And in my experience so far, when I can do that shift, when I'm rooted in my truer self, one of the crazy making things for my egoic mind that likes to know and plan and have it figured out ahead is that I actually don't know ahead. I often don't know what I'm going to say in the next moment. But it truly is where the magic is in my experience so far.
It's amazing. I can pick it up from there because I was just preparing for a course that is called Trauma-Informed Collaboration. And there's a whole map these days of what is called the polyvagal theory. And I'm not going to explain that because it's pretty complicated. But as I was preparing to actually tell people in the course how much of our workplace conversations are actually in a fight, and fleeing flight part of that, and that what we talk about and what you point to, Miriam, is like, can we come back to that social engagement where we are open and curious and we are mindful and we are in the present and we look at each other and we have that real conversation, as from conversare, I guess that's Latin. So it struck me again how much debate and discussion, as is used in the workplace, is actually a fight response. And that's why people are so tired, also because they have to go on and on and on, and they go beyond their boundaries or their of what is healthy energy wise and all that. So I was just half an hour ago preparing for that and was like, so if we come back to that question, like, what are the rewards to create that other space with these other roots? It's a lot of joy and groundedness and compassion and curiosity and creativity. And it's all, and yeah, how our working culture is actually pointing to you should be in fight mode to be successful, instead of, oh, let's figure this out together and let's see what do you think and what do I think and how can we create a response or a solution or whatever. So it just struck me that I was just preparing for that.
There are two pieces jumping out for me that I will try to bring in, because what you just mentioned, Ria, really forms the basis of whether we can continue growing as human beings. Because when we are in fight or flight response, we're stunted, we're frozen, and the energy is going towards fighting or flying or being frozen in space. And we're so much harsher to ourselves and to our environment when we're in that mode. There's no expansion, there's no space out of which to consider new ways of being, or there's no confidence to allow anything that you don't know. But then this bigger question of what is driving us, is it ego, a more primitive, ambitious drive, or is it an inner self? my mind very quickly goes to developmental models with this question, that I feel like it is a matter of time and where I am as the person, where I've been as the person that I am now. I'm now 41. And, when I was in college, I was driven by this stage of development that requires that kind of ambition to drive me. Yeah, I honestly would love to be able to talk about the developmental models a little more succinctly and proficiently. So whenever I talk about these models, I feel like there's a lot of reaction. I still don't have a graceful way of talking about them. But yeah, it has been my experience that there are so many dynamics playing into who is trying to do something, who is the person driving the bus. As the ambitious self in my 20s, I was very angry at my dad, who was a very ambitious person. So I actually had a very unhealthy relationship to that drive in me, and I suppressed it very strongly at the expense of stunting that mode of growth that is necessary to then be able to move into your more expanded self in time, right? And now somehow, this is a mystery how we grow. Somehow my growth did continue, yet it was incomplete at that level. Like I've never completed the fuller drive of ambition that stage requires in my life. I feel like I'm just finally getting healed enough to be able to fulfill it in certain ways, right? So yeah, I guess another thing I'm highlighting by sharing that is there's a beauty of that drive, that way of ambition, and like one of our Waldorf teachers says, like there's a time and place for everything. There's a time and place for it. And if we allow ourselves, if we have the opportunity to fulfill it fully, then it actually it propels our growth so that we can move more succinctly and more easily, more gracefully into this inner orientation from an outer orientation. Yeah.
Yeah, so lots to talk about here. One of the ways in which I look at it as a developmental model, and I think it has some benefits because I think it cuts through cultures better, is that I associate ambition with you appropriate a story, from the different stories your culture makes available for you. And you live in the story. You take all that energy, like when you're young, it arises. And so you don't have enough sense of self. So you live in that story. And I look at a lot of the traditional developmental models as you go through different stories, right? So you're actually moving through stories. And so in different cultures, what we wouldn't call ambition is actually still that pattern because they're still living in a story. So let's say a woman in India working really hard to please her parents. It's still ambition, not drive. It's not like this typical Western, because she's put all her energy in service to a story. But then there comes a point, and I know this is true for me in my life, that the story doesn't work anymore. I remember like running around New York, running a company, and one day being on the subway, and it was really awful day. It was before the subways were improved, and yet again it was really hot, and you're standing there on the straps trying to get to the client. You're kind of dressed up, and there's no air conditioning on the subway, so you're sweating like pigs, and the subway breaks down and stops in the tunnel. And we were all crowded in, and this poor man, he was pretty well dressed up, but he must have had like the flu or something, and he took a crap in his pants, and his butt was pushed up against my butt. And I was like, you know what? The whole story of like getting on the train and going to the clients and going to see Morgan Stanley and writing, the whole story was like just gone. And I'm like, you know, this is a horrible way to live. Like it's just, if you could just open your eyes. I'm reminded of, I can't remember what the name of the book is, but they talk about, these Englishmen brought these leaders of this foraging colony into Britain. They couldn't understand anything. They couldn't understand any of their choices. Like, why would someone live like this? And so when the story falls away, that's a gift, but it's a really interesting experience. And my response to that was, I left New York by myself. I packed everything I owned into a Volvo station wagon, old Volvo station wagon I had. I got myself a dog, and I went to live on an island in Maine, right? Like the complete opposite to that. And but there's a point at which I think, yeah, you don't live from the story. The story starts to emanate from your life, right? Like, and so this can be true for anyone. I mean, there could be someone on Wall Street who's not living from a story, but it would have that flavor to it. But what's interesting for me, like, I always tell this story, like the last couple of years, not this year because of COVID, you know, I started flying to Europe and giving presentations, and people would say, wow, that's really cool. And I would reflect on it, and I would say, you know, if my 40-year-old self thought this was what I was going to be doing, she'd be like, yeah, but there was no story attached to it. And just the plane and the first time I flew to Europe to do a 2-week presentation, 2 weeks of presentation, I was literally sick to my stomach, because all that flying time and all that, like, it just didn't make sense to me. You know, I mean, I was happy for it because I needed the work, but I also realized that I didn't have the luxury of the story that would kick in and think of myself as like this jet setter, you know? I mean, I kind of let the story in, so it would uphold me. I might as well enjoy it. But at the end of the day, it didn't have enough kick for me, you know? So noticing that, I think, is really powerful, that combination. But what's happened for me now is like, I'll be here at home, and I'm always doing stuff. Sometimes I'm not, but I have this nagging, there's still a nagging irritation that I'm not productive. Like, why should I just, like, I'm really good at taking care of this property and taking care of these animals and cooking. And then I ask myself, why is that not enough? You know, like COVID hit and I didn't have a job, so we got more animals. And I was like, I'm really good at taking care of baby animals, you know? And then I think, well, I should make a job out of cooking for people and taking care of their animals. Of course, you know, I did take care of people's gardens for years, but why is that not enough? Like, it seems, I would say energetically it's enough, but there's like almost an ethical nagging, like, yeah. I often wonder why I don't really need to start a new business. I'm launching another business, and I think it's interesting why that happens, or how that happens, or that it happens.
It isn't the cooking and taking care of the animals part of creating that a parallel space? where people could come and hopefully can come again after the whole COVID thing.
Yeah, but that's the whole question. Why does it have to? I'll give you an example. So, I remember my friend came once to visit, and he's like, he sees my horse. He's like, "Oh, what do you do with them?" That's always a question. Like, people usually don't ask you, "What do you do with your dogs and cats?" Because they're not big and they're not expensive. Oh, what are you going to do with them? And it used to really bother me. And then I go blah, 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 blah. I do workshops and blah. And I do those things, but I could tell this was like this blah, 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 because I needed to provide an answer. And eventually I got to say, I don't know, they just live here. So there's still that tendency to like justify, I have to justify, why should I live here? Why should this be my life? And it's not that I don't automatically produce value and like to produce work, but yeah, that factor still plays a role in my assessment of myself.
This really moves me to share about how my yoga studies of the last 15, 20 years are so ongoing, never ending. And I'm doing a somatic awareness training for yoga attunement right now. It's a wonderful training. Please, everyone can check it out. But it's life-changing in many ways. And of course, the number one question that comes from my husband is, so so what are you going to do with this? Like, how does this fit into your picture? I've been pulling so many strings together from so many different disciplines, and there's no way, I still don't know how to answer that question of what do you do? What do you do? I don't know. I work one-on-one with people, to help them heal, to help them switch. And I do it via, multiple modalities and disciplines. And how does this fit into what I currently do? Is that what you're asking? Or are you asking what else am I going to do with it? Like this question of, or this obligation to fulfill, like if I am paying money to attend a training, then I have to be making, 10 folds of that. Somehow there has to be return on investment, basically. That does come from that, achiever mindset, achiever story that is very prevalent in our culture. Like, I fall into that every time I want to do something, and then like, what am I gonna do with it? And yeah, it dissipates, but it's a painful thing to deal with on an ongoing basis, that I have to pull myself out of it, that, remind myself that I might not be able to say or even see how it comes together, but I know in my gut, I know in my heart that this is one thing that I'm doing that is coming together, and it is already translating into something, even though it might not be immediately visible or translatable. So yeah, it's a difficult line to walk on an ongoing basis.
I'm struck by how this whole question can be looked at through the individual personal lens. And I think we all hold that, like we all have a life. And I think amongst the five of us here, from what I understand, we've all felt in a way tapped on the shoulder with this sense of we're here to make a difference, like a sense of purpose. If we go back to our roots of when we were kids and teenagers, I think we can all kind of find those threads already alive there. And but I'm struck how that has both an individual sort of arc to it that I think we're all in our own ways, and then something that I've been feeling a lot over the last decade or two is coming to terms with, you know, when you were talking about the stories, Benita, I feel like there used to be a story that if you lived your individual life well, you had done a good job. And I feel like now, with the situation we have globally, me living my one good life is nice, but it's definitely not enough. And all of us doing that is not enough. And so I'm feeling, in a way, there's this other story that, you know, when you ask about what are the places, what's the reward? Well, it's kind of tricky, because I would feel like my life has truly served its purpose when, yes, there's some individual, in a way, expression and flourishing that feels authentic, but when I've been able to contribute to a much more meta-systemic story that I feel is actually, it's almost like the future is calling for that, and we're still coming with our personal stories, and there's this gap in between. And it actually feels really hard and painful and distressful at times to feel the gap between, here's little me trying my best with everything I got, and I see all the other little me's that I'm aware of, incredible people doing wonderful work, and it's not enough to answer the question that I think is present globally right now. So I just wanted to put in that is there's a story that I think we're feeling into that's not yet a story that is actually existing as a space to land into. So, you know, when you're talking about being on your farm, Benita, or I think of us being on our farm over here, the place of kind of harmony, of where it lands for me, is like, wherever there's an imprint of sanity, of wholesomeness, it matters. A bit like what I was sharing with you all a couple of weeks ago about this woman who was just acting on her stage somewhere in the desert, whether there was an audience or not, that there's a note put in the universe, or there's a groove that's set, or there's an imprint that matters, whether it's consciously recognized and applauded or seen by others. So that, I think, is true. And I actually feel, when I hear about what you're doing with the animals, I feel really good about it. I feel like life just became better. I don't know if that's the completion. I doubt it's the completion of everything you're here for, Bonnie, but it's good, right?
No, you know, that helped, listening to you feed that back, because I realized that, I mean, it is a delight that people come here and it changes their lives. People from year contact me, and just yesterday, and they dream of all the lore. And so that it happens is icing on the cake. That it has to happen to justify it is the problem. I think that's the little switch that I think is important in this. It's helpful to think of it that way.
Right. Can it be enough unto itself?
Right. And
Which
but the fact,
think that's like you acting on the stage, even if there's no audience, in the middle of a desert, night after night after night. It's, you know, to me, I mean, that was such an intriguing story for me to hear.
Yeah.
As someone who loves to create and feels driven to create, but does the creation only count when there's an audience? Has it only been a success when someone has seen it or heard it and acknowledged it? I think is part of the question. But the other part, which I was naming earlier, is it could be that however successful any of us is, from whether it's ambition or an authentic drive within ourselves, we might still be feeling some of the pain of it not hitting the meta-systemic question that I think is actually arising, and really is asking for an answer. So part of my contribution here is bearing the discomfort. It's like, I actually think, as we talk about tapping more and more into our authentic drive, we will still feel like it's not enough, and not for personal reasons, but for the reason of the whole.
Yeah, and that's probably where a much longer time frame comes in. I mean, if we look at that meta-systemic, whatever that is, it might not happen within the next 5 years, and it might already be happening, and it probably is through all of us. And yeah, just for me, it reminds me of, if you really understand complexity, like, you never know, whatever you do, what the ripples are going to be, who will eventually be impacted, if I can use that word, by what you do, or how it will travel. I mean, I've been sitting at my desk for so many hours to write my book, and then suddenly there are now people downloading the book and paying me 10 or 20 euros, or sometimes 50 euros. And I'm like, where did they come from? Like, I don't know these people. Somewhere they have heard, or they say like, yeah, this is amazing, and I've shared it with my friend. And I mean, we still sometimes think like we need to see the impact of what we do. And I sometimes now get feedback from 8 years ago, kind of, yeah, I was reading your blog before the book was out. And yeah, it's like, we're not used to that kind of complexity and time frame that we are in, I think.
There's so many threads I want to pick up on. Oh, wow. Yeah, I'm just sitting here musing on the stories that you offered, Vanita, and the importance of stories, and thinking about the movie that I mentioned and the cultural stories that we get. And Miriam, you kind of just blew my mind with that shift from the individual life well lived to this collective ambition project. Because I asked before I came here, I had a 20-year-old Bard student in my house. She's tutoring my daughter, and she's so decidedly of another generation. Like, I have a lot of friends in their 30s, and we can kind of, but I think I'm actually exactly the age of this woman's mother. So that's been a little bit of a shocker. But I thought I would take advantage of the generation gap and ask her about her generation and ambition. And so I just said, Emma, would you say that your generation is ambitious? And she said, yes, like that. And I said, oh, okay, well, in what ways? And she said, politically, and in terms of climate change, activism, like, and yeah, and art. She said she goes to an art-oriented school. But I said, well, how are you defining ambition? And she said, well, that's a good question. And she's like, I think we're just meant to change things, and we have big ideas about what needs to be changed, just like we're dreaming big here. And so it does kind of come around to what you were talking about, AJ, with that developmental stage, and at her age, I was fiercely ambitious. I was like determined to climb that corporate ladder, or any ladder. I was climbing all the ladders. And I've been reflecting about like where that came in me, because there's something actually really delicious in it too. Like when I reflect back on being young and feeling ambitious, maybe it's a little bit like Bonnie going to her Morgan Stanley meeting before the incident on the subway. There's something enlivening and like really, I don't know, rich about that kind of ambition. But mine was a totally individualistic dream. Like it was me at the top of the pyramid. And I'm not embarrassed to admit that. I've done a lot of work getting rid of that pyramid. But I think that's true. When I think about her response, it really feels like the mandate or like the message they're getting is one of this huge collective shift that needs to happen. And maybe their ambition is also sort of, I don't know, orienting itself around new stories. Yeah, I'll pause there.
But it sounds like their context is a lot more collective than when I was 20, which is actually a new thing. Yeah, it reflects our collective development. Good news. It's about time.
Yeah, so I want to build on my story because I'm realizing that there's probably a false assumption. I didn't have a job until I was 28 years old. I had a lot of drive, but I had no ambition. All the people I graduated with, they got corporate jobs. I went to a PhD program under a National Science Foundation grant. I thought it was the structures and the politics were just fake. I quit that. I went and tried to get a PhD in philosophy of science. I had so much drive and this theory I was working on, it didn't fit, and I quit that. Then I started living in a house with a bunch of art students from the Art Institute in San Francisco. Literally, I was homeless for a while. I lived in down south of Market Street in the old original Harley Davidson factory with a bunch of artists, some of them people that we let the homeless people live. I went to New York City and lived in a loft where there was a school for convicts. It was a commercial loft, a school for convicts upstairs to give them job skills, and they would take their welding things and try to cut through our door. And we made paper for artists. And literally, I didn't have any income until I was 28 years old, when I had a significant experience where I realized that I was on a path to kind of be like a homeless person in New York. It was fun when you had young and you had a lot of drive, but I had like zero ambition. But I was smart. I was already writing philosophy, the kinds of philosophy that got me into integral. So I was working. I was just driven to do the things that I wanted to investigate. I had like a drive in that way. It's interesting remembering that. So there was that drive. Yeah, so I tell my students this because they're often 28, maybe 30 years old. And I'm like, when I was 28 years old, after having done all that, I got a job for something like $9 an hour, taking a watering can around offices and watering plants. Then I ended up partnering with the woman to start that company. But I remember, and I was really poor and I didn't have any clothes. And I remember going into an office and seeing the father of one of the people I graduated college from. And I went into the wash closet and hid because I was so embarrassed about who I had become, from that perspective. And yeah, so then I built up the whole New York story because really, literally, I had to make money and I had to import this. And as we started growing the company and getting big contracts, yeah, that whole kind of identity, I could understand how the identity story could support that kind of ambition.
What do you mean by that last part, Bonnie? How the identity story could support the ambition?
Because, for example, and I always mention Morgan Stanley because it was where we got our first really big contract. So this woman and I were running this little company out of a room in her loft, and we take a wagon and move plants down from the plant district. But anyways, we got this job. We got this potential to pitch a big job to Morgan Stanley. They built a like 80 floor apartment new office building downtown, a financial district. And I remember wearing this black silk skirt that I had when I was in high school because I didn't have any clothes, and this little silk shirt, and going down there, and me and this woman, and then there was like 2 people from 3 different companies, and they were all suits, and they had their big briefcases and stuff. So it was like being in a story, right? So like I couldn't be who I actually was. We wanted to win this contract, and they had the contract was like 90 pages, they had all their lawyers and all this stuff, and so they were all going over it, and all this stuff was happening, and it was like being in a movie, literally. Like, this is what people do. I know what this looks like. I've seen movies like this, but I'd never actually been like that. And so we didn't really have anything to say. And I think we were actually only in there because the owner of the company, she had joined this woman's, she was very ambitious, and she had done like the facelift and she'd go to the gym. And I think she got there because of, some kind of like sexual leverage that she was really a very ambitious business person. So we got there, and I said, after they all said their thing, I said, look, what are we talking about here? It comes down to, is the person that's going to water your plant, care for your plant, or not? That's actually what it comes down to. And I said, and we hire people who like plants, So that was a little bit of the real me coming out, because we hired people like me who hadn't any ambition, and we're trying, like a lot of artists and stuff in New York. And we got the job. But what I'm saying is, like, if you were actually serious about what's going on, it's a ridiculous thing. The whole there's the people in the suits, they didn't have a gap between who they were and what they were doing. And for me, I was always playing in that gap. What I meant about the story of New York was when it no longer, like, if you can't continue to play with that story or be in the story, then it's very hard to keep that up. So, but just to come full circle, I don't want to take up all the time, but years later, here in where we live now, and in the life that I'd always kind of dreamed of, I was watching a movie with Sandy. I don't know what kind of movie it was. Well, it was one of those movies where, like, there's smart people in New York starting businesses, and they go out, and there's a lot of cool sexual things going on. And I caught myself feeling bad that I had given up on New York, and then I realized, but it was never actually like that. And that's what I mean. Like, and I told this story to one of my students. He's like, yeah, same thing happened to me. Like, I realized that the whole thing about living in New York or Brooklyn, or like, it's not really a good way to live, but the story can keep you going.
It's the mythical city. I remember after September 11th, Garrison Keillor wrote about that. What part of what happened was that the mythical city was damaged, in that moment. I mean, obviously the physical, literal city was damaged also, but that was part of the gut blow, was that it wasn't, you know, invincible. You know, I mean, it's interesting that we come around to New York City because in a way, it is the embodiment. Like if you had to pick the embodiment of ambition in a geography on the planet, I would say it would be New York City, although Dubai is really giving it for a run for its money right now. It's almost like Dubai picked up the old dream of ambition and now they're running with that one, and New York City is like floundering a little bit. Like, how do we do this collective, like how do we do the new thing? And I hope it finds its way, because there's something really beautiful about, you know, what New York City, the mythic city, stands for. Yeah.
I'm thinking to what Ichi was saying about how there's a time for everything, and there's a time for a more exterior version of ambition to run our lives, and there's a time when that runs dry and doesn't convince us anymore. And that when we're in that earlier version, like I remember having a chat with a friend. We would have been in our early 30s, and she was a mother, and her 13-year-old was listening in sort of on the side, the way they like to do. And we were talking about this very question. We were like, we feel like we were calling it the ego drive, so that more exterior ambitious part of ourselves. And we had both been very ambitious, you know, all through our youth and 20s. But we were feeling like it wasn't convincing us anymore, and we were looking for, so after that, is there nothing? Does it just kind of run flat? Do you just, are you just being, or are you still becoming? And so we were just contemplating together, what's that authentic drive? Because we could feel it in moments, but it didn't have the same sort of streamlined, it didn't have a script written for it. It didn't have those kind of stories or cities or places, as you mentioned, Ria, in the question at the beginning. That wasn't there. It felt much more emergent, and you got to kind of figure it out yourself. And I remember this 13-year-old just chiming in at one point and saying, well, I know what you're talking about, but I'm all about the ego and it's great. And we just laughed because it was so true. And I just wanted to say that when it's the time for that more ambitious version of drive, it's time for it, and it's actually a good thing, and it's a beautiful thing, and it's to be celebrated and rejoiced in. Where I think it gets a little sad is it sometimes seems it's the only fucking story on planet Earth, and it's actually running this planet to the ground, because it is ultimately, the ego is built on a sense of being separate from one another. Now, distinction is important and it's real and it's good, but when it's separate and forgets that underneath it all we're actually undeniably connected, then there's this pernicious rivalrousness that runs subtly and sometimes very unsubtly between us, that I think is ultimately killing us. And so I think it's the moment when that arc has kind of run its course. And for someone it might be in their 30s, for someone else on their deathbed, for someone else in their late teens. I feel like, you know, Bonnie, I was kind of nodding hearing your story, because I feel like I barely ever bought into that story ever. You know, in 23, I was already in Canada starting an intentional community with my husband, trying to create like a different version of how we can live on this earth and together. And I had said no to a bunch of things, which now I sometimes regret, like, you know, the offer to publish my master's thesis and things like that, which would have just been nice to get done kind of from that other version. And I just said, no. So, but I have noticed that there are very little, there's very few containers for that authentic drive to come through and find expression. And I think of that especially when I look at my daughter, who's now 17. And I mean, she's luckily in an incredible container right now. She's doing a wilderness program as we speak, and she's out up in the high mountains every day learning about avalanche training and all that kind of stuff. But it's a provisional container. And I feel like you know, a big part of what I teach around parenting is, can we accompany our kids so that we're doing two things at the same time? We're on the one hand helping them build a well-functioning, pleasant, decent, well-regulated ego self, which is actually it's a big accomplishment, you know, to have that versatile self that can engage with the world. But then the other piece that I always remind parents that I work with is we're also doing this other thing, which is keeping an experiential, not a cognitive, conceptual, theoretical, but an experiential reference point alive in them for their true self. Because the true self was always there from the start. It's always already there. It doesn't have to get built or constructed or developed. It's there. It's the isness, you know, whether we call that the soul or just that being. When you look at a newborn's eyes, and they're not trying to be somebody, they're not trying to make you like them, they just are. And it's so enticing to be around them, because I actually think it draws that self within us to the front. But can we do that with our kids, so that when they're growing up, they do have this exterior self that is kind of like a nice lightweight coat that protects them from the stormy weathers of life and from the sense of being separate, and they learn how to navigate relationships, etc., but not lose touch even as they're building that, even if that is that part of the arc they're in and it's to be celebrated. Can we stay connected with their true self, and can they know it unto themselves, so that when that story dries up, it's not like, oh my God, I have no idea who I am. There's already a knowing. And a lot of the choices, be it around partnerships or study choices or work engagements, are actually connected, at least to some degree, with that truer self. So that it doesn't come to this great midlife crisis where you've spent an entire life building up something that felt dry maybe a decade ago already, and it all crashes to the ground. But there's a much more of a, in a way, a gradual, almost like a, you know, a handing over of the baton, like in the relay race, where it's like, okay, ego, done now, I'm handing you over to the more authentic drive, off we go, kind of thing. And then that always begs for me the question, and so what are the spaces and places and opportunities for these kids as they grow up, so that they don't, in a way, stay too long on the one arc, even if it's already starting to dry up for them? Because that, I see that a lot. I see that in the 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds, they don't really buy into it. They don't really want to go to university and study something. They just feel like it's the only railroad track they can see and the only one people are talking about. And you know, the courageous ones will take a year off and go travel and try and see, is there something, like, it's like they're looking under stones, is there something else I can do? And maybe they'll find it, but most often they don't so far. And so that, I just feel is it's so sad. Like, we're missing, we as in a collective humanity are missing such an opportunity there, where that whole generation eventually just gets railroaded back into the old story instead of creating a new one. So I guess that's where I feel a lot of my drive is, okay, this is the time to create these containers together in little pockets and larger ones, and then connect them in a more metasystemic way, so that there's even a way to travel from one pod to another and not feel like you've just found a tiny little oasis and you better not move away from it.
Thank you, Miriam, for bringing it to bringing this piece, which is why I feel we began with this question of what are the rewards to create the parallel spaces with intention and exploration in a way that allows creativity for things that we cannot yet think of, for solutions, new solutions that we cannot yet even perceive to arise, so that we shift from planetary destruction to planetary regeneration, right? I think that's why we generated this question in the first place. And it really brings alive for me the question of, you know, how do we raise our children? like my son who's 5.5. Is there a way that allows for his, a healthy and, gradual, progressive ego development that would take its normal course while also keeping intact his access to his authentic self, which is what gets destroyed along the way if I let him go through the conventional system as it is right now? Yeah, that's an interesting question to me, and it also brings up the critique of the developmental models that I have worked with, anyways. That say, the achiever mindset is generally associated with a more individualistic drive, like you're in it for yourself, you're the separate self, etc. But I'm also hearing in our stories, from Bonnie's stories, and it's also true for me, and I'm hearing it in your story, Miriam, that you had ambition, I had ambition. I remember going into my master's program in sustainability. I remember being in business school, that was, when I'm 19, and looking around, on Fridays, we had to dress up. I went to Babson College. On Fridays, we had to dress up in business attire and like just pretend. I'm like, it was just ridiculous to me. It was ridiculous, but not to anyone else around me. It was not. They loved it. And I just couldn't bring myself to do it. And that is the beginning of my depression, because I just couldn't understand why I was so different, while all these people they were in it. They were fine with this game playing, they enjoyed it. So did I not have ambition that was appropriate for that age level? I think I had the ambition, but I was existing in a different story. I was in a more collective perception. I remember checking out a website that was telling minute by minute how many trees disappeared and how many species disappeared. I remember being in a business class, big hall, and I'm trying to show it to the person next to me, thinking, look what I found. Can you believe this is happening? And this person just brushes me off, like no interest whatsoever. I'm like, okay, I guess this is not important. Like, just having that cognitive dissonance and how I ended up, it took me then years. I had to drop into that story, live miserably for many years, because I just couldn't fit in and couldn't feel the jive like they do. And then coming back to my understanding of, all this time, this feeling of unease was very appropriate. It's not me who's crazy. There's something wrong in the perception of the collective that normalizes what we are doing here. So this distinction, this question is coming up for me of like, ambition, developmentally appropriate ambition can be there, but maybe in a more collective story, because it was there for me. It was there for all of you, but it's not there for everyone. And what's up with that? I don't know how to understand that.
I think the distinctions we're making here are really very valuable. And it's kind of my ongoing critique, but I think Miriam is also now, or this is living in Miriam too, and what Etche said. It's like, and I know this is a little simplistic, but it's still in the developmental story. And that is, we become achievers before we're self-realization. And they say, oh, you have to have a healthy ego. But what that means in our culture is you have to have a job and make money and play that game. And we can go and we can get research that says, yeah, that's what happens. People are achievers before they're self-realizers. So self-realization must be a later stage. But it's because the only path that we offer that achiever energy in general in the US and globally now is this office, make a lot of money, destroy the earth mindset. And so it's very context dependent. It's very channeled. The form that that stage takes is not the form that you always see. So yes, the research is very rigorous, but it's called an empirical fallacy. It's not because it's a deep code inside of people. It's because it's a deep code for human developed inside a capitalist, orange mindset, let's say. And so, and then we use this and we say, well, developing nations need to become like orange mindsets this is a huge disservice. This model is a huge disservice to education and pedagogy. And so then we're back to the question, like, I think for me, looking back is I couldn't see anything I could do with this energy except, get in with horse. I used it to be physical and to read and stuff, but there was no real obvious path that I could see, and part of that's probably I was blind also. But so the question is, since children grow up, and what we're saying is we see there's a lot of drive. I'm not sure, I'm going to take a risk here, that this whole political pathway that is channeling the drive of the new direction, new energy, I'm not sure that's healthy either. I think that's just the next phase in late capitalist society. And so the question is, what are the kinds of parallel spaces or pathways or pipelines that are being built so as the new generations come up and their energy goes there? How do you build that up? It's like all this energy is like water, and it's a tsunami that's going to go in the irrigation canals that you set up. And so that's one point. And the second point is also what Miriam said, is that the core self, it's not like you have to get a business and a job and this and that, and then you go back and you start taking yoga classes because now you're ready to work on your authentic self. And in our society, we think that this is something that happens very late stage, and there's a lot of research that shows that's actually not true. There's a lot of research that shows that children have meta cognitive capacities at a very early age, but because that's late stage, of course, it's threatening. If you're developing metacognitive and authentic self capacities at an early age, people aren't going to want to go down those channels when they become achievers. They're going to want to change the world. But I think sorting out the language of development is crucial, because it's great that development is taught in business school now, but it's the wrong story. It's the wrong story.
So what is the right story?
I think here we are at the end of the Nicolas Cage movie, and we're going to leave our viewers hanging.
This is where we say we're going to launch our workshop for $59.99. You can come and learn with us. No, it's a question. It's a living inquiry, I think, in our lives and in the lives of
All of us.
the whole humans.
I feel like something I said at the beginning is kind of tapping in my awareness again, which is the shape, the exterior form a life takes is not indication of whether it's coming from ambition or authentic drive. And so I think even as we know there needs to be a variety of containers and opportunities for young people and young adults to find themselves in and be supported in. And I really want to underline variety, because I've seen kids where, like, I know one family, they had a blended family, they had 5 kids, and they send them all to Waldorf school, so the Steiner school system, because it's great and it's right in our town and it's an awesome community. But over the course of 3 years, they ended up with 2 still in there. One went to the Catholic school, one went to the public school, one was homeschooled. Like, each child needed something different to really jived with that system, and others didn't, for really good reasons. So I think otherwise we could just be countering an old story, and then that's just really another old story. So there's something about creativity. To me, it's almost like instilling in kids, in youth, you can create, you don't have to fit in the box. Like, like my husband has been such a great model for me with this, because if I'll say we got to think out of the box, his attitude is more like, what box? Like, he just doesn't even see a box. And that's the kind of energy that I feel needs to be much more spread out across our humanity, is like, who said we need a fucking box? Like, what if it's more simple than that? What if it's not as complicated as, oh my God, now we need to create a whole new world for these up and coming, authentic drives to express themselves? No, an authentic drive is by its very nature creative. So it's just, in a way, it's removing the constraints of this is the one way to success, and opening up the doors and opening the windows and letting fresh air come flying in and going, there are many, many ways to be successful. There's many, many ways to live a life. Find out who you are, follow that with curiosity and kindness and courage. And I'm here. I've got your back. I'm here with you, to help you when you know what step you need to take. There's a program, I might have mentioned it in one of our prior conversations. It's the Willing Worker on Organic Farms. It's called WWOOFing, and it exists in lots of countries. And over the years, we've hosted so many young people right at that cusp. They just graduated. They're anywhere between 19 and 25 from all around the world. And so I do see those kind of there's some bridges that already exist, where it's like, if you don't want to just get out of school and go into the next school, you can travel, you can visit people's homes, you can see how they've created a life. And that was the feedback we got most consistently across the board from all these young adults, was simply a gratitude to see a version of life that works. To literally just watch us live in our house, eat the food we cook, work in the garden, build the trails in the forest, have discussions around supper tables, and just go, you showed me a different version of a possible reality that I can live as an adult and as a family. Thank you. So anyways, I kind of wanted to say, we don't have no answers. We have some. And I feel a lot of them are more seeds or vectors, but not the end result, because that's not ours to actually figure out for another person.
Yeah, and it's not the train track. It's like 100 pathways or 1,000 pathways. And I just want to, underline what you said. Like, we live with 4 people in a normal house on the countryside in Belgium, and we have kind of a big garden. And when people come, they're like, wow. And they're like, many times people the expats living in Brussels, and they're like, wow. And it's just a garden with leeks and beans and potatoes. And I mean, and it's nothing fancy at all, but just that you can live with 4 adults in one house and have a household together. And it's like, wow, and how do you do this? And how is that? And it's like, you can try it too. If we can do it, you can try it too. It's sometimes not easy, but in general, it's pretty okay. So it's, I think that's what, and not, I'm not so much encountering youngsters, but people who are like 40 or whatever, and they are in that, like, you can call it midlife crisis, and it seems that comes earlier and earlier in people's lives these days. Like, I need to switch. There's something not aligned. What am I going to do? And just, yeah, I have quite some conversations with people, like, and then I'm saying, like, do you know this, and do you know this person and that organization? And it's like I'm like throwing seeds out to people, and then they pick up whatever they can use or something. I think that's one of the deeper reframes, that there is not one train rails laying there, and like you go to school and then you go to university and da, da, da. But it's like, okay, there's so many diverse paths you can probably take. Yeah.
Maybe we are at the end of our time.
Yeah, I was wondering if we could also speak, what are the rewards if doing that, inviting these people to our homes, basically. And I'm not sure I've ever named that. What are the rewards of creating these spaces? But just to have these conversational spaces that I now do, and these open sessions with collective presencing, it's so amazing what people come up with. It's so amazing, the collective wisdom that you can gather when everybody comes with genuine curiosity and listening and contributions. And I'm like, every time I'm like, wow. Yeah, I mean, these are random people that I don't know, and it's amazing. That for me is the reward. And you can even see them grow over a couple of sessions, and that's, yeah. Or grow is maybe move the roots more into that space that Miriam said in the beginning, like more into their authentic self. So I find that really amazing. That's my reward, basically.
Well, it's certainly not monetary. Just kidding. I'm kidding, but it had to be said, because, you know, the whole like follow your bliss, and then you'll, you know, if you do your heart's work, you'll like, surely the money will come. And my friend David and I talk about this a lot. It's like that is, I mean, maybe that's obviously that can be true for some people, but it's not necessarily the experience for everyone at this stage of the game. And it's heartbreaking to me when I'm counseling people at that point of transition where they're leaving the corporate, you know, where they're leaving that story, and I'm just representing some other possibility. And also the word permission keeps coming up for me. Like, I think we can also just offer a safe space and give permission for people to think that there could be another track or their own track. But we do frequently get stuck around the money. And I have certainly struggled financially. I mean, as soon as I left my executive job in advertising, it just went, you know, and I've had ups and downs for sure. Like, I'm figuring it out, but yeah, I mean, that could be a whole nother conversation, but just to be kind of funny, but also put something important into the space. The system still rewards participation in a, in the capitalist track, that serves its aims. Not to be cynical, but yeah, how do we want to wrap this ongoing dialogue?
Can I just say one thing? Because I think what you're sharing, Sky, is in a way a result of a lot of individuals trying to do that on their own. And so I think what we're still missing, which in a way would be a next step, which would be a great one to explore, is we have now individual homes, small little, collectives doing things like you spoke about, Ria. We don't really have larger collectives offering examples, like literally an experience that you can move through, walk through, live in, and feel it in your cells of like, wow, this could actually also be reality. So my sense and where I'm putting a lot of my work attention and focus on is how can we create those kind of literally, what my husband and I are calling sane villages. Can we do that so that we are creating more collective containers while giving the individuals permission, but then there's places to fall into, to be held, where it's not everyone out for themselves trying to figure out this new groove in the universe that they're trying to create from their authentic drive, but it's actually held together in a larger whole. I think that's really important. Otherwise we're asking too much, because we're relational beings and we do need each other more so than ever.
Go ahead.
I just want to piggyback on that, because I feel like it is one of the gifts of COVID to at least my family, and I feel like many others who were maybe at the verge, who had some capacity to try, and experiment with new structures in their lives. And it certainly is what you just mentioned, Miriam, is exactly what we are also interested in. How do we create those collective spaces? How do we end up in one, be it an existing one, be it, it could be as small a unit as 2 families coming together, just 2 families coming together. I know this because this is the conversations we're in with another family right now. Just that scenario makes everything that you could be doing double possible, because now you're 2 families. I feel like there are many people that, at least around our communities, who are looking and reconsidering the ways they live, and they're trying to figure out how is this transition possible. I also want to add that kind of the story of, these stories of how we have transformed from executive corporate jobs to these other ways of living and being and making a living. They're generally more drastic so far. I really want to do offer that all kinds of transitions are possible, that nothing has to be, in fact, nothing should be black or white, that people can, if we can shift our perception of time, if I can see myself creating a new thing, not for tomorrow, but in 5 years, and be able to hold a vision over time, which is one of the benefits of yoga. That's what yoga really teaches, in my understanding. Then it's possible to create the world we are all yearning for. Yeah.
Seemed like a good ending. And maybe presenting us the next question. Who knows?